She had cleaned their house for 7 years. She knew which floorboard creaked on the upper landing. She knew which window latch stuck in winter and which radiator knocked at night when the heating came on. She knew the smell of the house in every season, fresh paint in spring when Diane had the hallway done, cut flowers in summer from the garden Oliver never tended properly, the particular warmth of a well-heated house in December when the family gathered, and the kitchen stayed lit until late. She knew all of it. What she did not know, until the afternoon she opened a cardboard box in the attic, was that the family she had been invisible to for 7 years had never been strangers to her at all. Before we begin, remember this. While the story you're about to hear is fictional, the message behind it is very real. At Zara Tales, we believe the right story at the right moment can change a life. The house was on a wide, tree-lined street in Dulwich, South London, the kind of street where the houses had names as well as numbers, and the wheelie bins were kept discreetly behind wooden gates. It was a Victorian terrace, double-fronted, with a bay window on the ground floor and a wisteria that covered the left side of the facade in summer and left bare branches against the brickwork in winter. Inside, the rugs were good. The furniture was old in the way that meant expensive rather than neglected. The kitchen had been extended and modernized at some point in the previous decade, all pale stone and brushed steel, but the rest of the house retained the original features: high ceilings, original fireplaces, the cornicing in the front reception room that Marcia dusted with a long-handled brush every 3rd week because Diane noticed if it was left. Marcia Campbell had noticed the house from the... She had been living in Peckham then, 2 miles and a different world away, sharing a flat with her friend Claudette while she built up her cleaning clients. She had come to Dulwich for a trial day and had stood on the pavement looking at the house for a moment before ringing the bell, struck by the particular solidness of it, the way it sat on its plot like something that had decided it was exactly where it meant to be. Diane Whitfield had answered the door herself. She was a tall woman, upright. Her hair was silver gray and well-kept. She wore no jewelry except a watch and plain gold studs in her ears. She looked at Marcia with the measuring expression of a woman assessing whether the person in front of her would fit the requirements of the role, and then she smiled the particular smile that said the assessment had concluded satisfactorily. She showed Marcia through the house with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. She explained her requirements precisely, which rooms were cleaned on which days, how she liked the linen folded, where supplies were kept, the specific products she preferred for the wooden floors. She said she had had housekeepers before, and that what she valued above all else was reliability and discretion. She said the last word with a particular weight that Marcia had noticed and filed away without quite knowing what to do with. Marcia took the position. She moved into the small room at the top of the house, not large, but with its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the back garden and beyond the rooftops, the hazy distances of South London. She unpacked her things into the chest of drawers, hung her 2 good blouses on the rail, set her small framed photograph of her mother on the windowsill, and got to work. She was good at the work. She had been cleaning professionally for 18 years, and she approached it with the thoroughness. She knew the difference between a surface that looked clean and one that was clean. She knew how to move through a house without disrupting its life. She knew how to be present in a room without intruding on it, a skill that domestic work required, and that most people who employed domestic workers never thought to acknowledge. There was a rhythm to life in the Whitfield house that Marcia came to know the way she knew the rhythm of her own breathing. Diane left at 8:15 on weekdays, always in good shoes, always with the same quality of prepared composure that suggested she had been organizing herself since 6. She returned at different times depending on the day, earlier on Tuesdays, later on Thursdays when she had her book group. She ate dinner alone most evenings, simply prepared, and retired early. She was not an unhappy woman, as far as Marcia could tell. She was a woman who had built an organized life, and who maintained it with considerable discipline. The discipline was both her strength and the thing that kept everyone else at a slight distance. Oliver was less predictable. He moved through the house like a weather system, warm fronts and cooler ones, periods of energetic presence and long absences, stretches when the house felt fully occupied, and others when Marcia and Diane moved through it like the 2 solitary people they essentially. He was thoughtful in irregular ways. Once he left a book on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said, "Marcia, think you'd like this." And she had read it and she had liked it, and he had never mentioned it again, which she thought said something accurate about him. She did not think about leaving. The question of whether she was happy in the house was one she never quite applied to herself in the way the question was usually meant. The room was comfortable. The work was familiar. The pay was reliable. Phyllis, her friend from her early Peckham days, asked her sometimes whether she minded living so far inside another family's life, whether it left enough room for her own. Marcia always said she had what she needed, which was true. What she had was enough. Whether enough was the same as happy was a question she saved for the Sunday phone calls with Yvonne, where certain things could be said at a distance that could not be said face to face. Yvonne said she worried about Marcia. She said she worried that Marcia had spent so many years making herself useful inside other people's houses that she had forgotten to build anything of her own. Marcia said she had her room and her work and her routines and her Sunday calls, and that was a life just as much as any other kind of life was a life. Yvonne said that was not what she meant. Marcia said she knew what she meant. They left it there, the way sisters left things that were true and not yet ready to be fully addressed. The Whitfield family consisted of Diane, who was widowed. Her husband Gerald had died 8 years before Marcia arrived, and her son Oliver, who lived in the house on and off in the way of adult children who had not quite committed to fully leaving. Oliver was 31 when Marcia arrived, the kind of man who was easier to like than to know, easy in his manner, generous with small. He came and went at irregular hours. He occasionally left dishes in the sink that were not his dishes to leave, and Marcia washed them without comment because that was the arrangement, and because Oliver, unlike his mother, always said thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it. There was also a daughter, Patricia, who lived in Edinburgh and visited at Christmas and occasionally in summer. Patricia was efficient and remote in the way of a person who had built a life far from where they grew. She was pleasant to Marcia in the slightly performative way of a person who considered themselves progressive. Marcia noticed this too and filed it in the same place as everything else she noticed. Diane was the difficult one, though difficult was not quite the right word. Diane was exacting. She was the kind of employer who never raised her voice but who communicated dissatisfaction with a precision that was in some ways more demanding than anger. A certain stillness when she entered a room that had not been done to her standard. A particular way of refolding a hand towel that had been folded wrong, slowly, in front of Marcia, without comment. She was not cruel. She was not dismissive in the obvious way. She simply occupied a register of social interaction that made clear, at all times, that there was an order to things and that everyone in the house understood their position in it. Marcia understood her position. She had understood it in every house she had worked in for 18 years. She was good at occupying the role without disappearing inside it, which was a particular kind of discipline. She kept her own counsel. She observed without commentary. She did her work well, and she went to her room at the end of the day, and she called her sister Yvonne in Jamaica on Sundays, and she was, in the ways that the Whitfield family could see, entirely contained within the life she appeared to be living. She had been at the house for 3 years before she first noticed something that did not fit. It was a small thing. A photograph on the mantelpiece in the study, a room Diane kept largely to herself, and which Marcia cleaned but did not linger in. The photograph was of Gerald Whitfield, Diane's late husband, in what looked like the 1980s. He was standing outside what appeared to be a pub or a club in the kind of group that men stood in when they were young and confident, and the world seemed arranged for them. Marcia cleaned around it every week the way she cleaned around everything in that room. But one Tuesday afternoon, moving the photograph to dust the mantelpiece beneath it, she held it at a slightly different angle and noticed the man standing to Gerald's left. He was a tall man, very dark-skinned, with a wide smile. Not the same man, but close enough in stance and smile that her hands had gone still for a moment, and she had stood there with the photograph in her hands and looked at the face until the resemblance resolved itself, and she understood that it was not who she thought, and she put the photograph back and continued cleaning. But the feeling did not entirely leave. She did not mention it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to. She called Yvonne on Sunday and they talked about the usual things, Yvonne's grandchildren, the church roof that had needed fixing for 3 years and still was not fixed, what Marcia had cooked that week, and whether the supermarkets in London had proper callaloo or only the tinned kind. Marcia did not mention the photograph. She did not know yet why it had unsettled her, and until she knew, she was not ready to speak. The years went on. She turned 50. Oliver left the house for good and then came back and then left again, this time with a woman named Sasha who seemed pleasant and whom Diane greeted with the same measured warmth she gave everything. The wisteria bloomed and faded and bloomed again. Marcia learned the rhythms of the house so thoroughly that she could have navigated it in the dark, which she sometimes did, coming downstairs early in the morning before the rest of the house was awake, moving through the familiar rooms in the gray pre-dawn light like a person entirely at home in a place that was not hers. Then came the attic. Diane mentioned it on a Thursday morning in March. She said she was having the storage company collect some items the following week, and that she needed. She handed Marcia a typed list of categories: items to donate, items to store properly, items to dispose of, and said she would be out for the day and trusted Marcia to use her judgment. Marcia went up after lunch. The attic was accessed by a pull-down ladder from the upper landing and was the one part of the house she did not clean regularly, only when Diane asked. It was full in the way that attics were full in houses that had held the same family for decades. Boxes stacked. She worked through the afternoon methodically, opening boxes, checking contents against the list, marking each box with the appropriate category. Most of it was straightforward. Old kitchen equipment. Books that had been replaced by newer editions. Gerald's golf clubs that nobody played anymore. Curtains from before the extension was built. She moved through box after box with the steady efficiency of someone who had done this kind of task many times and who did not need the owner present to make sensible decisions. She was nearly finished when she reached the last stack against the far wall, behind a rolled-up rug that had taken some effort to move. The boxes here were older. The tape on some of them had yellowed, and the cardboard had the particular soft quality of things that had been sealed for a long time. She checked the first two quickly. Old letters, which she set aside for Diane to look through rather than deciding herself. Christmas decorations from what looked like the early 90s. She opened the third box and found photographs. Not framed ones. Loose ones, hundreds of them, the kind that people used to have developed at chemists and collect in envelopes, dating from what looked like the 1970s through to the late 90s when digital cameras began replacing film. She was supposed to put them in the preserve category and move on. She knew that. She had almost put the lid back on the box when one of the photographs near the top caught her eye. She picked it up. It was a photograph of a woman. Young, perhaps mid-20s, standing in what looked like a garden. She could see a garden wall behind her and the corner of a house that was not this house. The woman was holding a baby. The baby was perhaps 3 or 4 months old, wrapped in a white shawl, eyes closed, the small particular completeness of a very young infant. The woman was looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite smiling. More than that, fuller than that, the expression of someone who could not contain. Marcia looked at the woman's face for a long time. Then she set the photograph down on the floor beside her, very carefully, and picked up the next one. Same woman. Same garden, different angle. Same baby. A man beside her this time, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at the baby. The man was Gerald Whitfield. She had no difficulty recognizing him. She had been dusting his photograph in the study for 7 years. He was younger here, perhaps early 30s, his hair darker, but unmistakably Gerald. He was looking at the baby with the expression of a man for whom this particular moment was the most important thing that had ever happened. Marcia looked at the woman again, looked at the woman's face in the way she had looked at the man in the study photograph 3 years ago. The same stillness came over her hands. The woman in the photograph was her mother, not a resemblance, not a similarity. Her mother. Marcia had grown up looking at that face every day of her childhood, and she knew it in the way you knew the face of the person who had given you yours. The particular angle of the jaw, the way her eyes sat in her face. The small scar above her left eyebrow from the fall she had taken as a child and always used to cover with her fringe. Her mother at 20-something, in a garden in England, holding a baby, with Gerald Whitfield's arm around her shoulders. Marcia sat down on the attic floor. She sat there for a long time without moving. The afternoon light came through the single attic window and moved slowly across the floorboards as the sun shifted. She held the photograph in both hands and looked at it, and let the full shape of what she was seeing settle into her understanding the way a large object settled into water slowly, with displacement, changing everything around it. Her mother's name was Enid Campbell. She had come to England from Jamaica in 1971 as a young woman of 19 and had lived in London for 6 years before returning to Kingston. She had never spoken much about those years. When Marcia and Yvonne asked, as children, she gave general answers. She had worked. She had lived in a house in South London with other people from back home. She had saved money. And then she had come home because England was cold and the people were not always kind. And she had come back to Jamaica and within a few years had met Marcia's father and built the life that Marcia and Yvonne had grown up inside. Their mother had died 4 years ago. Marcia had flown back to Kingston for the funeral and had held Yvonne's hand through the service and had spent a week sorting through her things before flying back to London and back to this house and this life. She had gone through everything her mother left. She had not found any photographs of England. She looked again at the baby in the photograph. She looked at Gerald Whitfield's face. She looked at her own hands, holding the photograph, and thought about the timeline. Her mother had been in London from 1971 to 1977. Marcia had been born in 1970 in Kingston before her mother left. Yvonne had been born in 1968. That accounted for both of them. But if the photograph was from the mid-1970s, and from the clothing and the quality of the print, she estimated it was from 1974 or 1975, then the baby in the photograph was not Marcia. It was not Yvonne. It was someone born during the years her mother was in England. A child she had never mentioned. A child who would now be in their late 40s or early 50s. Marcia set the photographs down and pressed both palms flat against the attic floor. She thought about Oliver. She thought about Patricia. Oliver was 38 now. Patricia was 42. Neither of them was mixed race. Neither of them looked like they could be the baby in the photograph. She thought about Diane's face, always composed, always measuring, and the specific quality of the way Diane had looked at her on the day she arrived. Not simply assessing whether she would do the job, but something else underneath it, something Marcia had noticed without being able to name. The particular quality of a person recognizing someone and choosing not to say so. She sat in the attic for another 20 minutes. Then she put the 2 photographs in the pocket of her apron. She closed the box and marked it with the preserve label. She finished the remaining boxes, came down the ladder, folded it back into the ceiling, and went downstairs to put the kettle on. She called Yvonne that evening, not Sunday. Thursday, Yvonne answered with the slight alarm of someone who expected routine and received deviation. "Marcia, you all right?" "I need to ask you something," Marcia said. "About Mum." She described the photographs without sending them. She described the garden, the baby, the man. She described his face and gave the name, Gerald Whitfield. She asked Yvonne if Mum had ever mentioned that name. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to tell Marcia what she needed to know before Yvonne said a single word. "Yvonne," she said quietly, "tell me." And Yvonne told her. Their mother had told Yvonne when Yvonne was 45 and their mother was 70 and ill and had decided, in the way that people decided things when they understood that time was no longer unlimited, that certain truths needed to be passed to someone before she went. She had told Yvonne because Yvonne was the eldest, and because Yvonne, she felt, would carry it steadily. She had made Yvonne promise not to tell Marcia until Marcia was ready, or until the knowledge became necessary. Yvonne had kept the promise for 9 years, through their mother's death and after it, carrying it in the particular way of a promise made to someone who could no longer release you from it. Their mother had been in a relationship with Gerald Whitfield for 3 years during her time in. He was a young man from a South London family, already with prospects, already with a family that had expectations for him. Enid had been working in the same office where Gerald worked. They had loved each other, or something close to it, in the way that young people loved across distances that society kept reminding them existed. In 1974, Enid had become pregnant. She had told Gerald. Gerald had told his mother. And Gerald's mother, a woman whose name Yvonne did not know, had made clear that this was not a situation the family would accept. Gerald, young and not yet brave enough to be the man he might have become, had agreed. He gave Enid money. He arranged for a friend to help her find accommodation. He did not marry her. He did not claim the child. Enid had the baby, a boy. She named him and cared for him for 3 months, and then, because she was alone and young and had no family in England and no money beyond what Gerald had given her, she made the hardest decision of her life. She gave the baby up. She went through a private arrangement, not a formal adoption, something quieter than that, the kind of thing that happened in the 1970s when women in impossible situations had nowhere else to turn. She handed her son to a woman who had agreed to take him. She never saw him again. She went back to Jamaica the following year. She never spoke of it, until she was 70 and ill and told Yvonne, because the truth needed to go somewhere. Marcia sat on the edge of her bed in the small room at the top of the Whitfield house and held the phone against her ear and listened to her sister's voice carry 30 years of silence across the distance between South London and Kingston. When Yvonne finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. The line between them held the particular quality of shared weight, two people carrying the same thing from opposite ends. Marcia asked why Yvonne had not told her when their mother died. Yvonne said because Mum had asked her not to unless it became necessary. She said she had tried to honor that. She said she was sorry. Marcia said she understood, and she did, even though understanding it and not feeling the sting of 9 years of withheld knowledge were two different things that she would need to separate at a later moment. After she hung up, she sat for a long time in the dark room. The city moved outside the window. She could hear the occasional bus on the road 2 streets over, the distant particular hum of London at night that was always there if you listened for it, the sound of millions of people inside their separate lives, all occupying the same space at the same time, without knowing most of what the people nearest to them were carrying. She thought about the morning she had arrived at this house, the way she had stood on the pavement and looked at the solidity of it, the way Diane had opened the door. She had thought it was professional assessment. She understood now that it was something more complicated than that. Recognition at a distance. The look of a person seeing a ghost of something they had stored very carefully away. She thought about 7 years of careful courtesy. 7 years of not quite being seen while being entirely present. She did not feel wronged by it in the way that she might have expected to feel wronged. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of grief for the ordinary relationship that might have existed between 2 women who shared a connection, if that connection had ever been acknowledged. The kitchen table conversations that had never happened, the questions never asked, the name never spoken. 7 years of proximity that had been, in the most significant possible way, a form of maintained distance. She was not ready to be angry. There would be time for that, perhaps, later. What she needed now was to be clear about what she knew and what she was going to do with it. She went downstairs at 6 in the morning and made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the early light and thought about what came next. She had a brother, a half-brother, her mother's son and Gerald Whitfield's son. He would be 50 years old now. He had grown up somewhere, in some family, with some name that was not Campbell and not Whitfield, shaped by a life she knew nothing about. She thought about the photograph, the baby in the white shawl, eyes closed, entirely unaware of the story already beginning to arrange itself around him. She thought about Gerald Whitfield in the study photograph, serious and silver-haired, a man of standing and property and family reputation, and she thought about the specific gravity of what he had. The chest of drawers, her 2 good blouses on the rail, the framed photograph of her mother on the windowsill. Her mother at 50, laughing at something outside the frame, her head tipped back the way it always tipped when she found something genuinely funny. Marcia looked at that face for a long time. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and thought about Diane, about the specific quality of Diane's look on the day Marcia arrived, about the 7 years of careful, restrained courtesy, not unkind, never unkind, but always with that particular weight to it, that measuring quality, that sense of someone managing a situation they had decided not to address. Diane had known who Marcia was, or she had suspected, or she had recognized the name and the face and the Jamaican connection and filed it in the same way that people filed things they had decided not to examine. Marcia thought about Diane's husband, dead 8 years. She thought about what Gerald might or might not have told his wife. She thought about the box in the attic, sealed for how long, placed there by whose hands, kept for what reason. She went downstairs at 6 in the morning and made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the early light and thought about what came next. She was 54 years old. She had lived and worked in this house for 7 years. She had cleaned this family's floors and folded their linen and moved quietly through their rooms in the way that housekeepers became part of the house itself. And all that time, in the attic above her head, in a sealed box, was the evidence of the thing that connected her to this family in a way that employment never had. She did not feel angry. That surprised her. What she felt was something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who had been carrying a weight they did not know they were carrying and had just been told the weight had a name. She waited. Diane came home at 3:30 that afternoon. Marcia heard the key in the door and the particular sound of Diane's heels on the hall tiles, always measured, always even, the footsteps of a woman who moved through every room as though the room were being evaluated. She heard Diane set her bag down, heard her go to the kitchen for water, heard her footsteps on the stairs. Marcia was sitting in the front reception room. She had not been asked to be there. She was not cleaning. She was simply sitting in the chair by the window with the 2 photographs on the table in front of her and her hands folded in her lap. The afternoon light came through the bay window and fell across the photographs. Diane appeared in the doorway. She stopped. She looked at Marcia. She looked at the table. She looked at the photographs. The thing that moved across her face in that moment was not surprise exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who had been waiting for a door to open and had finally heard the handle turn. She came into the room. She sat in the chair opposite. She did not reach for the photographs. She looked at them from where she sat, and then she looked at Marcia, and Marcia looked back at her, and the room was very quiet with only the sound of the street outside and the particular stillness of a house holding something that had finally been brought into the light. Marcia said, "My mother's name was Enid Campbell." Diane looked at her. "She was in London from 1971 to 1977, Marcia said. "She worked in the city. She met your husband. She had a baby in 1974. Diane's hands were in her lap. Her posture had not changed, but something in it had shifted slightly, the way a well-built structure shifted when something foundational moved beneath it. She said nothing. Marcia said, "I need to know what happened to that baby." The silence lasted a long time, long enough that the light in the room shifted slightly as the afternoon moved. Then Diane exhaled, not dramatically, quietly, like a person releasing something they had been holding so long they had stopped noticing the effort. She said that Gerald had told her before they married. He said it the way people said necessary things, not fully, not with every detail, but enough. He said there had been a woman. He said there had been a child. He said the child had been placed with a family through a private arrangement, and that he had no further information. He said it once, and then he did not say it again, and Diane had decided, in the way that young women in love made decisions that they later understood differently, that the chapter had closed before she arrived. She said she had not known about Enid by name. She had known only that she was Jamaican and that she had worked in the same office as Gerald. She said she had not allowed herself to know more than that because knowing more would have required her to do something with the knowledge, and she had not been ready. Then, 7 years ago, when she was looking for someone to help in the house, she had received Marcia's application. The name, the Jamaican background. The age, which put her birth in the right period to be related to the woman Gerald had described. She had looked at Marcia's face in the doorway, and she had seen something that she had no certainty about but could not dismiss. She had given her the position. She had told herself it was a coincidence. She had spent 7 years not examining it. Marcia listened to all of this without interrupting. When Diane finished, Marcia looked at the photographs on the table and then back at Diane. She said she was not there to cause harm. She said she was there because she had a brother somewhere who was 50 years old and who had grown up without knowing his mother's name, and who deserved, if he was still living, to know that he was not simply a private arrangement. He was Enid Campbell's son. He was Gerald Whitfield's son. And whatever had been decided in 1974 had been decided for everyone except the people most affected by it. Diane looked at the photographs. A long, careful look, the look of a woman spending real time with something she had kept at a careful distance for a long time. Then she said that Gerald had kept some documents, that there was a name on those documents. A family name, the people who had taken the child. That she had kept the documents because she had not been able to bring herself to destroy them and had not been able to bring herself to act on them. She said they were in the study, in the drawer of the desk. She said she had put them there herself after Gerald died and had not opened the drawer since. Oliver arrived home at 6 that evening. He came in through the back door the way he always did and stopped when he found his mother and Marcia sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of documents between them and 2 cups of tea that had gone cold. He looked at their faces. He looked at the documents. He sat down without being asked. They told him. Between them, with the 2 photographs on the table and the folder open and the particular quietness of the kitchen in the evening, they told him the whole of it. Oliver listened the way people listened when a story was rearranging the furniture of everything they thought they knew. He asked 2 questions, and both questions were about the brother, where he might be, whether the documents gave enough information to find him. Not about his father's choices or his mother's silence. About the brother. That was the thing about Oliver. He was easier to like than to know, but in the moments that mattered, he was consistently on the right side of himself. The documents gave enough. A family name. A borough of London. A year. It was not everything, but in the age of records and registries and the particular diligence of someone who knew where to look, it was a beginning. Oliver said he knew someone who did this kind of work, reconnecting people through historical records, tracing individuals through the systems that kept the details of lives. He said he would make the call in the morning. Marcia looked at him. She thanked him. She said it the way she said things that she meant at full weight, simply, without decoration, with the gravity of someone who had spent their life managing the difference between what was said and what was meant. That evening, after Oliver had gone upstairs and Diane had said a careful good night and gone to her room, Marcia sat alone in the kitchen for a while. She called Yvonne. She told her what had happened, from the attic to the kitchen table to Oliver's offer to find the name. Yvonne was quiet through most of it. When Marcia finished, Yvonne said one thing. She said that their mother would have wanted this. Marcia said she knew. She went to her room and stood at the window for a while, looking out over the back garden and the rooftops beyond it. The city was doing what it always did at that hour, settling into its evening, all those lit windows and moving lives, the particular density of London at dusk, everyone inside their own story. Somewhere in the city, probably, was a 50-year-old man who did not know his mother's name, who had grown up with a family that had chosen him, in the same decade that Enid Campbell had made the hardest decision of her life, who had lived 50 years without knowing the shape of what. She thought about her mother in that garden in the mid-1970s, holding the baby she was going to have to give away, looking at the camera with an expression that was more than a smile. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about the years of silence. The careful, complete silence of a woman who had put something unbearable in a place she could seal, and had spent the rest of her life building a new life around the sealed place. Marcia understood that kind of silence. She had lived in this house for 7 years in a silence of her own. The silence of being present without being seen, of knowing the rhythms of a family's life without being part of it. She had always told herself it was the nature of the work, and it was. But sitting at Diane's kitchen table that afternoon with the photographs between them, she had been seen. Fully, finally, in a way she had not been in 7 years of sharing the same roof. She did not know what came next. She did not know whether the man Oliver's contact found would want to be found. She did not know whether knowing would help him or cost him something he had made his peace with not having. She did not know whether she and Yvonne would ever stand in a room with a brother they had not known existed, and whether that room would be a beginning or simply an acknowledgement of all the years that could not be recovered. What she knew was what she always knew. That the truth, however late it arrived, deserved to be received properly. That a person's beginning mattered, even when the people who shaped it had tried to make it disappear. That Enid Campbell had come to England at 19 and loved a man and had a child and made an impossible choice and had carried it in silence for 50 years, and that somewhere in the weight of all of that was a life that had simply not been able to find the words until now. Marcia turned from the window. She straightened the cover on her bed. She set her mother's photograph face up on the windowsill, the way she always did, and she looked at it for a moment, her mother laughing, head tipped back, the light just right. "I know, Mama," she said quietly, "I know." Then she turned off the light and went to bed in the house that had been hers for 7 years and was about to become something she did not yet have a name for, something more than employment, something less straightforward than family, something that was, perhaps, simply the truth arriving in the only shape it could, slowly, incompletely, after too long, but arriving all the same. Some secrets are kept to protect people, and some are kept to protect decisions, and some are kept because the cost of telling them feels greater than the cost of carrying them. But secrets carried for 50 years have a weight that the person carrying them can no longer calculate clearly. They become part of the walls of the house, part of the sealed box in the attic, part of the careful courtesy of a woman who recognized a face at her door and gave it a room in her house, and spent 7 years not asking the question she already half knew the answer to. The truth does not disappear because it is not spoken. It waits. It moves through time in the photographs and the documents and the small recognitions that a person notices and files away. And when it finally comes into the room, it does not ask permission. It simply sits down at the table and waits for the people around it to decide what kind of people they are going to be. Thank you for watching this story on Zara Tales. If it moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one.